Ever since the Korean War broke out in 1950, the entire balance of payments deficit for the United States from the 50s, 60s, and the 70s has been military spending abroad. The private sector, trade and investment is exactly in balance over all these years. How going off the gold standard essentially enabled the United States to fund its balance of payments deficit, meaning its military spending abroad, by pumping dollars into the global economy and having these dollars end up in foreign central banks and be recycled. Well, what that meant is that America's whole military spending for the last 50 years depends upon the dollarization system in other countries using dollars as their monetary reserves in place of gold and instead of their own currencies. That means that as they move away from the dollars, there's no way that the United States can finance its 800 military bases abroad and its military spending. Russia doesn't have this problem. The military generals don't study the balance of payments, and many of them are right-wingers that have a sort of crude, monetarist, Chicago school neoliberal view of money without understanding that money is debt, and specifically monetary reserves are not only America's treasury debt, but the monetization of America's military spending. Now, what Scott pointed out is that Russia doesn't have this problem. China doesn't have this problem because they're not trying to create a foreign empire. They're not trying to put military bases in other countries where they have to somehow spend their domestic currency and buying local currencies to do whatever military operations do there. So they don't have the constraints that the United States have. And that's what's essentially leading the United States to say, we're not only at war with Russia and China militarily, we're at war with them financially. We don't want the BRICS, China, Russia, Iran, and their other countries, to have an alternative of not using the dollar, so that the dollars that we spend abroad for all these military operations are going to be somehow recycled to the United States. That's why you're having Trump try to browbeat India, Japan, Korea, Europe into somehow promising to recycle all the dollars to the United States. Why is he doing this? It's not simply to pay tariffs so that the Treasury will have more money and can cut taxes on the wealthy even more. It's so that the dollar will not be forced down, so that there will be a huge inflow to support the dollar, basically, despite Trump's hope of devaluing the dollar slightly, slowly downwards, to as if that's going to make American exports more competitive. The whole fight over the dollar isn't really about U.S. exports being more competitive, because the United States doesn't have much industry to export. It's really about the balance of payments, which is primarily military in character, not the trade deficit, not the investment deficit. And that's what's the government used to realize that.
Okay, another way of saying this is that the United States cannot afford the empire. The problem is it can't do it. In the early decades after World War II, the balance of payments, correct me if I'm wrong, Michael, saw export surplus from the United States, generating the capital, the money with which then to finance the 700 or 800 bases around the world. And so you had the rest of the world dependent on exports from the United States, having to pay for them in the money that was then used to subordinate them militarily to keep this game going. By 1970s, this game was over because the Germans, the Japanese, the Europeans had recovered from the war, as we knew they would. That's what they were doing in the decades from 1945 to 1975. In that 30-year period, the United States lost its preeminent position in the world economy as an exporter. It would either have had to stop because it could no longer finance its military adventures abroad by its export surplus, or it would have had to do what Michael so nicely described. It would have to have found another way, and the dollarization, making all oil contracts denominated in dollars, and hyping the threat of the Soviet Union, which the Europeans are copying today because they don't know any other politics. This was enabling them to then create the deficit program. They would make the United States a net importer, switch its own production out of the country, no longer needing these exports, no longer being able to afford them. They weren't profitable enough to produce in the United States. And you replaced all the workers either with machinery and with automation or by exporting the jobs. So your end result was the story Michael just told. You could continue to finance your global military adventures, but now you finance them by means of imposing, if you like, on the world the need to hold reserves for their currency, because the agreed relationship among currencies was gone. That's what we had coming out of the Bretton Woods, and that's what we ended when Nixon took us off the gold standard in 1971. So then you have Michael's story. But let me do something we don't do enough of. Let me tell you a little bit on this program about the limits to all of this. In order to sustain now, when you have no exports, and when the ability of the United States to import is shrinking every day because the mass of our people are simply too poor. I mean, the statistic came out this week that the top 10, if I have it right, the top 10% of the income distribution accounts for 50% of the consumer demand in our society. All right, that's another way of saying that the bottom 90% are piss poor. They can't afford anything, right? Well, given that we depend on imports, that's not a good basis for the future. We're not going to be able to run the kind of deficits that we used to. That's my guess at this point. All right, what then is going to sustain the story Michael told? How are we going to pay for all of those bases? We don't have the exports to do it, and we're not running the kinds of deficits, nor is the rest of the world eager to accumulate dollars in the way that they were before. And that was true before BRICS became important. The decline of the dollar as a reserve currency is at least 30 years old. The Chinese once had 1.2 trillion. They have 750 billion. I know these are big numbers, but that's a big decline. It's not surprising, but it's a big decline. And so for me, I'm beginning to wonder, how long can you keep this up? And when you add the degree to which military payments in this country are a Keynesian support of aggregate demand in our society, then you see he can't afford a military, but he can't afford not to have the military. And I suspect that's the reason why Mr. Trump, who comes into office promising to stop the endless wars, has neither stopped them, nor has he been able to avoid proliferating more war. He attacked Iran, and he's busily now provoking Venezuela and taking extraordinary steps to do it. And giving carte blanche to Mr. Netanyahu is extraordinary. You know, we wonder, why would a government do these extraordinary things? And in a way, Michael's story gives the beginning of an answer, that there's more going on here than macro management. That's important. And there's more going on than balance of payments. That's important. There's also managing the military, the budget and the activity when you're so badly out of whack. You can't beat the Russians in Ukraine. That's what's obvious. It's obvious to the whole world. They can't let go. What's the matter here? Even in Vietnam, they understood we've been defeated, and the Americans withdrew, and the Communist Party of Vietnam took over and has remained the government ever since. That's 35 years ago. Right? What is it now? maybe more than that, 50 years ago. Then they were defeated in Afghanistan and they withdrew. Mr. Biden, in the end, did what the previous presidents couldn't dare do, which is to say, this is hopeless. And so they're losing. Harper's Magazine just came out this last week, and on the front page is the lead story of the magazine, which, here's the title: Why do the American military keep losing all the wars? Wow, you're now even able to ask in a public way the forbidden question. And if the rest of the world is worried about the United States economically, we have to remember it was also worried about it militarily, and that danger is receding as we see what's going on in the world. The desperation inside the United States, the fascistic turn that we are assaulted with every day, is a reflection of all of these dead ends confronting the people who run this system.
There's a common denominator that links the dynamics you've just meant, and that's oil and foreign investment in oil. Much of the buildup of the reason that there was a gold inflow to the United States from 1945 to 1950, when the Korea War broke out, was not simply U.S. exports. It was the sale of oil by the American oil industry that was in control of the world's oil. And for the last 100 years, and I've made this point before on our show, Nima, the cornerstone of America's control of money and the balance of payments and military coercion has been oil, because along with food and agriculture, because if you have the ability to monopolize oil, you have the ability to cut off other countries' industrial potential, just like depriving Germany and Europe of Russian oil and gas has ended their Germany's and Europe's industrial potential. Now, that explains a number of things that you've seen recently. Not only has America continued to do everything that it can to isolate foreign purchases of Russian oil, but same thing with Iranian oil. It's tightened all of the sanctions against it. And the reason that Iran was overthrown in 1984 was largely because it wanted to nationalize the oil, and the Americans and British together, it was a British Iranian oil company at that time, felt they were losing control of the oil leverage. Well, fast forward today, you're seeing in the news, nightly news, every night here has been taking off with Venezuela. Why Venezuela? It's not really drugs. Just like Israel claims that all Palestinians are Hamas, the United States claims that all Venezuelans, their fishermen, their population, are drug dealers. Well, the reason that America, the news, leads off with blowing up a fishing boat every night, or another boat that has no seeming connection to drug dealing at all, is the United States is trying to create a narrative that this fight against Venezuela is a fight against drugs. It's a fight to not only to regain control of Venezuelan oil, but more specifically to prevent China's recent negotiations with Venezuela to invest in the developing Venezuela's enormous oil reserves under Lake Maracaibo. And imagine what the United States is worried about. Not only is China making itself independent of America's allies' supply and control of the oil industry from Russia, but now China can get its oil from Venezuela itself, and the fight in the Middle East using the alliance of Israel with the Wahhabi jihadists to create a disaster there is to prepare the war for controlling Iraqi, Syrian, and most of all, Iranian oil. The United States still dreams of reestablishing its diplomatic, economic, political, and military control of other countries by controlling oil and food. That's the other basic means of control. That America can impose sanctions on its food exports to starve other countries into submission to its policy, as it tried to do against Mao after the 1945 revolution, until Canada broke the blockade. Well, right now you're seeing China shift voluntarily shift its way, its imports for soybeans away from the United States to Brazil to buy its soybeans there. And China has, until this year, accounted for 50% of all soybean production in the United States. And it's 70% of soybean production in the case of North Dakota. Well, all of a sudden, there's zero demand from China for soybeans. And yet you have a perfect storm for American agriculture. You have the corn and soybean crop, a bumper crop this year because of the extreme weather. All of this crop is piling up. There's nowhere to sell it. They don't have enough storage capacity to put the soybeans and corn in silos. There's a huge market now in big plastic bags to begin storing them in. This is a disaster, and the farmers are pressuring Trump to say, you've got to be able to reestablish our market next year. We've been dependent on soybeans, and what can we shift to? We can't shift to corn. People are not buying our agricultural exports anymore. So not only has America lost its ability to use food like it's used oil to starve other countries, denying them American exports, but it's lost its agricultural sector. And the result is that land prices are collapsing in North Dakota and other areas. They're falling because the farmers are not able to meet their debts. For the last 150 years, all of the financial crises in America, Europe, the Northern Hemisphere, have occurred in the autumn, in September and October. And there's a reason for that. It was called the autumnal drain. It's when farmers would have to borrow the money to move the crops to sell them for markets. Well, right now, that autumnal drain threatened to lead to a break in the chain of payments, insolvencies, arrears, bankruptcies, and foreclosures. That's what they're talking about now in the American Northwest. Foreclosure and Midwest, foreclosures on the agricultural land that doesn't have a customer. And there's nothing that Trump can do about this now, because the shift is irreversible. Now that China is making a deal with Brazil, saying we cannot rely on America's soybean exports any longer, because Trump has weaponized every element of foreign trade. He's weaponized the oil trade. He's weaponized the agricultural food trade to try to make other countries dependent enough to shake them down for his protection racket. Well, we don't need the American market. Thank heavens we have you in Brazil. So the Brazilian farmers are reorganizing, replanting their agriculture to shift into soybeans. Once they do this, if Trump goes back and tells China, okay, you can depend on us again for our soybean exports, China is going to say, well, wait a minute, we're not going to double cross Brazil, where we've just made an agreement to trade with them and to trade in our own currency, not trade in dollars, but trade in our currency. Once we've made this shift, and the whole national economy, Brazil, has been shifting to dependence on our market, we're not going to turn on a dime like you do in the United States and just say, okay, we're going to change and have a new market. A change is irreversible. You can imagine how the threat of America losing the ability to use food, soybeans, grain, wheat, and oil, because of the moves by China and other countries to become alternative suppliers to the United States, means that America's lost the two leading elements, not only of its exports, but of foreign investments in oil and farmland that American investors have controlled. They've lost the ability to support the dollar. And by not supporting the dollar, it means not providing the foreign exchange that the United States needs in order to maintain its military presence abroad, that it remains as heavy a drain today as it was during the Vietnam War that forced the dollar off gold to begin with. So when you put the military strategy and imperial strategy in the context of the balance of payments, you find the great constraint that confronts the United States. And that's what my book Superimperialism was all about. And as I said, the major audience was not foreign readers wanting to fight against imperialism. It was the Defense Department, State Department, CIA that used it as a how to do it book. This is how you have to look at the context of America's military and non-military diplomacy.